Kyle Dubas was hired by the Pittsburgh Penguins right before free agency in the draft last offseason, and to say his first season with the Penguins went as expected would be a complete lie. In his short amount of time with the team last offseason, Kyle completely reshaped the look of the Penguins, but as we all know, it wasn't enough to get the Penguins back in the playoffs. But before we dive too deep into the season, let's start from the beginning and talk about how we got to the circumstances leading up to Kyle's hire. But before we do that, please consider dropping a like on the video and consider subscribing. It's free, you can always change your mind later, and it really helps me out and gets my videos out to more people. Now, let's truly start from the beginning. The 2022-2023 season for the Pittsburgh Penguins was one of the most disappointing seasons in recent Penguins history. The Penguins missed the postseason for the first time since Sidney Crosby's rookie year in the league, and Ron Hextall rightfully took a lot of the blame. At the trade deadline, he cleared a bunch of cap space looking like he was gearing up for a big move, and then he made his big acquisition and got Mikael Granlund. Saying it out loud now, it's still just as confusing as it was when the deal was made. It was a horrible trade. Despite all the shortcomings from their GM, all the Penguins had to do was beat the Blackhawks and the Blue Jackets and they would clinch the playoffs. And as I found out in person as I was at that Blackhawks game, they lost, and then they went on to lose the Blue Jackets game as well, and they missed the playoffs. Penguins ownership Fenway Sports Group was fed up with the results and wasted no time and made sweeping changes across the organization and fired Ron Hextall and Brian Burke. Now let's go up north a little bit and go and see Kyle Dubas' lead up to when he joined the Penguins. Kyle Dubas' Toronto Maple Leafs made it to the second round for the first time since the early 2000s, and then they got absolutely dismantled by the Florida Panthers in the second round. At Kyle Dubas' end-of-season press conference, he alluded to the fact of maybe considering trading one of the members of the Core Four. Kyle Dubas' contract was up with the Toronto Maple Leafs, and he was almost a surefire look to get an extension for it. But apparently, him making these comments didn't sit well with Brandon Shanahan, and he ultimately wasn't brought back. And then, almost as quickly as he was fired, he got hired by the Pittsburgh Penguins and quickly became the president of hockey operations. Kyle Dubas came into the team and ultimately knew what state the team was in. The Stars were still playing elite, but the rest of the roster was absolutely failing. At the same time, the end of this core's run is in sight, so he also has to start stockpiling young assets while also keeping the team competitive. When you have stars that are still playing at an elite level and giving you all the production in the world, you have to compete for the cup, especially when you have the ones that have the pedigree for the ones in Pittsburgh. But now that we have the background set, let's go into Kyle Dubas' first offseason. First strong draft with the team, especially considering they didn't have the most amount of picks. The most notable prospect coming out of that draft was Braden Yeager, who's looking like a very good first round pick and could potentially crack the roster this upcoming year. Knowing that there had to be a lot of changes made to this roster, Kyle proceeded to let Danton Heinen, Brian Dumoulin, Dmitry Kulikov, Jason Zucker, Casey DeSmith, Mikael Granlund, Jeff Petrie, Nathan Legare, and Jan Rutta all go. Whether this was free agency or by a big trade that I'll get to in a second, they all left the organization and it made big changes and big holes in the lineup. Looking to clear cap space while also getting better, Kyle made the infamous Erik Karlsson trade, which ended up actually getting the Penguins $3 million in cap space, even while taking on $10 million of Karlsson's contract. Seeing all of the holes that needed to be filled, Dubas wasted no time in free agency and made sweeping changes. He brought in Ryan Graves, Matt Nieto, Will Butcher, Riley Smith, Alex Nedeljkovic, Magnus Hellberg, Lars Eller, Noah Chari, Ryan Shea, Radim Zohorna, Andreas Johnson, Vinny Hinostroza, Rem Petlik. And on top of that, he also re-signed a couple of players, the most notable being Tristan Jarry, Drew O'Connor, Ty Smith, and Jonathan Gruden. One notable person that wasn't re-signed last offseason was Jake Gensel. All of the fans wanted him re-signed, but a deal was never able to be agreed upon. Dubas would later state in a press conference later in the year that the main thought process for free agency was that he wanted to build the top six to drive the offense, while the bottom six would be very defensive focused. For those of you who don't remember or who maybe are unaware, the 2 seasons prior to last offseason, the bottom six was atrocious. They couldn't score, but they also couldn't keep the puck out of their own net, and when you're failing in your bottom six, that leads to big issues. It leads to your stars in your top six getting tired a lot faster. It leads to a bunch of unnecessary goals and a bunch of unnecessary deficits that the team has to try and make up for. Especially when these people aren't scoring, having them be a defensive liability is a very big issue. But with that offseason being set, let's head into the season. The season had a lot of highs, but it also had a lot of lows, and it didn't go anywhere close to how Kyle was hoping. The team struggled right out of the gate and were almost never able to make up that lost ground. The Ryan Graves signing looked absolutely brutal right off the bat, and it looked even worse as the year progressed. By the end of the season, fans were calling for his head and wanted him absolutely nowhere close to the defense and wanted him replaced with guys on entry-level contracts. Another big issue was the defensive bottom six could keep the puck out of their own net, but they generated next to zero offense, and that severely hurt the team. Sidney Crosby was playing phenomenal, but one player can only do so much. You need depth all throughout your lineup, and that's how the Penguins won their cups back in 2016 and 2017. Even with all of their struggles and all their flaws, the team hung relatively close enough to a playoff spot that the players kept engaged and didn't lose hope. All of that was until early 2024 when everything came crashing down. The team was on and off on losing streaks and couldn't string enough wins together, and it looked like they were out of the playoff picture entirely around the trade deadline. If we go back to what I was talking about earlier, the Penguins and Jake Guentzel were never able to agree upon terms for a contract, and it was always kind of a what-if scenario if the Penguins weren't close to a playoff spot by the trade deadline. And right before the trade deadline, Jake Guentzel got hurt and went on LTIR. And with that being the case, Kyle Dubas had to make a very hard decision and let one of the franchise cornerstones over the last couple years go. The Penguins traded him to the Carolina Hurricanes, and they got a pretty decent return for him, but it was heavily criticized at the time. But especially looking back on it now, considering the Carolina Hurricanes didn't keep him either and just got to use him in the second round of the playoffs, it doesn't look that bad. And the Penguins ended up getting Michael Bunting from him, and that was a really good trade, and he fit really well with the team. But after Guentzel was traded, I've never seen anything like it. The team went into a big depressive state, and they weren't able to do much of anything on the ice, and they lost a ton of games. Crosby was dominant all year, but once this happened, he didn't look like himself and just looked like a shell of his former self. And rightfully so. Guentzel was one of Sidney Crosby's longest line mates and probably his best line mate ever, and he was just gone. But eventually, the Penguins were able to pick themselves out of it enough, and suddenly they found themselves back in the playoff race at the end of the year. For those of you who didn't pay attention to the standings this year, the East wasn't very good, to be honest. A lot of teams that were fighting for that final wildcard spot were all losing all at the right time for the Penguins to make a push for the playoffs. The Penguins started winning, and all the other teams started losing. A big reason for the Penguins winning was their very solid play from their hot goalie, Alex Nedeljkovic. Stole the net from Tristan Jarry and got all of the consecutive starts to end the season, and he did super good. Another big thing during this time was the acquisition of Michael Bunting from the Guentzel trade. He came in and slotted on the second line perfectly with Evgeny Malkin. Evgeny Malkin was starting to look like Father Time was catching up to him for a large portion of the season, and then Bunting came in and reignited them, and then he played great towards the end of the season. But as we all know, the Penguins weren't the only ones fighting for that wildcard spot, and while they did put on a very impressive run to end the season, they did miss the playoffs, and the Washington Capitals snuck into that last playoff spot, and then they got absolutely decimated by the New York Rangers. This most recent season was probably the complete opposite of how Kyle wanted it to go, and some of his moves ended up looking brutal very fast. Riley Smith got off to a very hot start with Evgeny Malkin at the start of the year, but then he never really meshed well with the team, and reports started coming out that he was unhappy and never wanted to be traded to Pittsburgh. Seeing that he really wasn't working in Pittsburgh, Kyle Dubas took the initiative and he got traded to the Rangers this year on July 1st. The worst move that Kyle Dubas made was bringing in Ryan Graves and locking him up to a massive contract. Right now, that contract looks absolutely untouchable, and he fit horrible in the system, with Dubas even mentioning him by name towards the end of the season at his last press conference. Another major issue for Dubas was re-signing Tristan Jarry last offseason. Tristan Jarry played amazing in the first half of the year, and then by the second half of the year, he was playing horrible and eventually lost the crease to Nedeljkovic. Jarry also got locked up to a big contract last offseason, and many fans are being very critical about that right now. With those players being locked up to big contracts, they look almost unmovable, and reportedly Kyle Dubas has been trying to shop them this offseason, and there's absolutely no buyers. When Kyle Dubas was hired, Fenway Sports Group gave Kyle a 7-year contract, and we've only experienced year 1 so far. I truly believe that he has a plan that he is going to execute very well. The idea of remaining competitive while also stockpiling their farm system is something that is almost impossible with modern day sports. But unlike the previous administration, there's at least a solid plan in place. When looking at the most recent offseason, the 2024 offseason, it's very easy to see what the plan is. All of the deals that were signed in free agency or acquired by trade have been 1 to 2 years long. This allows there to be a lot of flexibility with the players, and the Penguins could potentially move them. For example, if the Pens are good and are able to put together a good season, you can keep those players and make a push for the playoffs and potentially a run for the cup. But if the season looks long gone by the time the trade deadline rolls around, you can easily flip those players on expiring deals to contenders for young assets and prospects and draft picks. This is purely just speculation on my part, but I honestly could see the Penguins still making a trade to acquire young assets in draft picks and prospects if they can at the trade deadline, even if they're close to the playoff spot. We won't really know that part though until we get deep into next season. At the end of the day though, every great empire must fall, and Father Time doesn't stop for anyone. The core is getting older and their play will eventually start to drop off, and that may be past whenever this team is truly ready to compete again for a Stanley Cup. Kyle Dubas is a very new-aged hockey mind, and I believe that he'll be able to help usher in the next great era of Penguins hockey, even if there are some growing pains that come with it now. No fall of an amazing sports team or a dynasty is ever pretty, but is something that happens to all of them. Time will tell how this will all shape out for the Penguins, but the vision is there. It just may take time. Thank you so much for making it this far into the video, and I would really appreciate it if you could leave a like on the video to help spread it in the algorithm, and leave a comment letting me know your thoughts on Dubas' tenure so far. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.